Garrett Holloway had only meant to buy cold medicine and a carton of milk that evening, errand enough for a man who kept his world deliberately small. But the lakeside road was dark and poorly lit, and the sound reached him first. A sharp mechanical shriek followed by the dull percussion of steel against concrete. He saw the headlights carve a wide arc off the road, saw the car slam into the guardrail and shudder to a stop, and saw the first thin curl of smoke begin to rise from beneath the crumpled hood. People were already pulling over to stare. Garrett was already moving. Stay through the end, because the mechanic everyone in this town dismissed was not who any of them imagined. Briar Glen was the kind of town where everyone knew the names of their neighbors' dogs before they knew the neighbors themselves, and the garage at the corner of Aldrich Road and Route 11 had been part of the landscape long enough that most people drove past it without seeing it anymore. The sign above the bay doors, Holloway Repair, plain white letters, no logo, no phone number on a banner, and the man inside moved the same way the sign looked, without performance, without announcement. Garrett Holloway was 38 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that told the whole story of his adult life, even when his face told nothing at all. He wore a canvas work jacket that had faded from green to something closer to gray, and he moved around the engine bay of an old pickup truck with the calm of someone who had long ago made his peace with the fact that most work is invisible. The town knew the outline of him the way small towns always do. Single father. Wife died of an illness 4 years back. Raised his daughter, Maddie, in a wood-frame house at the edge of the tree line, where the neighbors were sparse and the mornings were quiet. Maddie was 9 years old and possessed of the particular intensity that children develop when they grow up as the emotional center of their parents' world. Watchful, precise, warm in the way that a person is warm when warmth has been chosen rather than inherited. Garrett dropped her at school each morning before the garage opened, picked her up each afternoon before dark, and on Saturdays made pancakes at a diner called Elwood's where the coffee was bad, and the booths were cracked, and neither of them ever wanted to sit anywhere else. The people of Briar Glen thought they understood Garrett Holloway because the shape of his grief was readable, and because he asked for very little. And in small towns, those two qualities together are usually enough to make a man seem entirely known. He was not entirely known. The garage held a rolling tool chest, a lift that groaned when it rose above 6 feet, and a small back office with a space heater and a metal desk cluttered with parts invoices. Against the far wall of the office, behind a water-stained cardboard box of engine manuals, sat a fireproof safe bolted to the concrete floor. Garrett opened it perhaps twice a year, and never in front of anyone. Inside was no cash. There were 2 items of note: a satellite phone sealed inside a static protective bag, its screen dark but its charge maintained by the trickle adapter plugged into the safe's interior socket, and a small hinged case containing a metal badge embossed with the letters HSG in a font that managed to be simultaneously restrained and unmistakable. There was also a single key on a plain ring, old Rolls-Royce, the style that predated the modern push-button fobs by decades. Garrett had not held any of these objects long enough to be tempted by them in years. That evening, before he closed the office and left for the pharmacy, he opened the safe out of no particular impulse he could name, looked at the 3 items for a moment, and shut it again with the same motion a man uses to close a door on a room he has decided not to enter. The drive to Haverford Pharmacy took 12 minutes on the main road. Maddie had been fighting a low fever since Tuesday, and Garrett wanted the children's decongestant and the specific brand of warm oat milk she preferred when she was sick, the kind that came in a blue carton. He noted, without deciding whether the observation was relevant, that the black sedan 2 cars back had been there since he turned onto the main road, its plates partially obscured by a cracked bracket. He catalogued the detail without alarm and without acknowledgement, The way a man catalogs things when noticing has become so habitual it no longer requires conscious effort. He bought the medicine, he bought the milk. He turned back onto the lake road in the direction of home. Celeste Mercer had not intended to leave the city that night at all. The meeting with Mercer Automotive's board of directors had run 40 minutes over schedule, and by the time the last of the senior council filed out of the glass-walled conference room on the 22nd floor, she had already missed 2 calls from her personal assistant. The subject of the meeting had been the Phoenix series, the company's flagship electric autonomous vehicle, set to launch in under 60 days, and more specifically, the manufactured uncertainty now gathering around it like weather. Someone had seeded technical questions to 2 automotive trade publications simultaneously, timing the release to coincide with a routine regulatory filing. It was too precise to be coincidence, and Celeste had said as much to the room, and the room had looked back at her with the particular blankness that means half of them already knew. Von Mercer had offered to stay and help her think through the communications strategy. He had said this in the tone he used for kindnesses that were not kindnesses, his voice calibrated to the register of a man performing concern for an audience he expected to outlast. Vaughn was 42, her father's nephew, a man who had spent 15 years accumulating influence within Mercer Automotive without ever accumulating accountability. And Celeste had understood from the age of 26 precisely what he was, and had spent the 9 years since managing him with the careful, exhausting attentiveness one reserves for unstable things. She declined his offer without looking at him, picked up her coat, and took the private elevator to the parking structure. She drove herself when she needed to think clearly, which was often. The car was a late-model executive sedan with an onboard driver assist system she had helped greenlight 2 years prior, and she had driven it enough to know its handling profile by feel. She was 70 miles east of the city when the first anomaly registered, a brief shimmer across the navigation display, there and gone, the kind of flicker the system's self-diagnostic would record and attribute to a minor processor fluctuation. She reduced her speed and noted it without concern. The second anomaly came 8 minutes later. The brake pedal offered slightly too much resistance on a gradual curve, and the correction came a half-second delayed. Celeste reached for her phone and found 2 bars of signal. She was 3 miles from the lakeside turnoff. The third anomaly was not subtle. The steering column locked for approximately 4 seconds. Long enough at her speed for the car to drift substantially across the lane, and then released all at once as though a circuit had been interrupted and then restored. Celeste countersteered hard, but the road narrowed there at the curve's apex, and the guardrail came up faster than physics should have allowed. The right front quarter panel struck the barrier at an angle that spun the nose toward the embankment, and the car came to rest against the concrete buffer at the edge of the drop, the front hood compressed and immediately beginning to smoke. She was not unconscious, but the impact had knocked her sideways against the door, and the seatbelt had seized across her sternum with a force that made deep breathing immediately difficult. She could see the orange flicker through the gap in the crumpled hood. She tried the door. It did not move. Outside, she could hear the sound of other cars slowing, see flashlight beams swinging across the road. Nobody was coming any closer. The smoke was thickening at the dashboard's lower edge. And then, through the fractured driver's window, she heard footsteps moving fast and without hesitation, and a hand, covered in motor oil grease, appeared at the glass. Garrett had assessed the situation in the time it took him to stop his truck and get the door open. Battery position, wind direction, structural integrity of the remaining panels, estimated seconds before the smoke density inside the cabin became a primary hazard. The checklist was not something he had consciously trained himself to use, but it activated regardless. He had a compact fire extinguisher mounted under his passenger seat and pulled it loose without ceremony, crossing the road at a pace that was not running, because running in these situations is imprecise and imprecision costs time. 4 people stood on the shoulder watching. 1 had a phone raised. None had approached the vehicle. Garrett discharged a controlled burst from the extinguisher along the hood seam where the smoke was thickest, buying seconds rather than solving the problem, and moved to the passenger side where the glass remained intact, but the door frame had buckled outward. He broke the window with the strike plate using a single clean blow to the lower corner. Safety glass. It separated into chunks rather than shards, and reached inside for the door handle. The frame was bent enough that the mechanism would not release. He could see the woman clearly now, alert, her eyes tracking him, her breathing compressed by the seatbelt. "Look at me," Garrett said. "Breathe slowly. I'm going to get you out." He used the blade of his multi-tool to cut through the seatbelt housing at its base anchor. The belt released and she exhaled sharply as the pressure across her chest eased. The fire had caught more fully now, the orange light climbing the gap between the hood and the fender, and Garrett could smell the specific combination of burning insulation and superheated coolant that told him he had perhaps 90 seconds before the cabin became something other than a rescue site. He got his left arm under her shoulders, and his right hand braced against the door pillar and pulled her toward the window opening with steady force, guiding her head below the broken frame, angling her body to clear the center console. She was moving cooperatively, not panicking, trying to help, and that made the extraction faster than it would otherwise have been. When she cleared the door frame, he walked her backward, away from the vehicle and the guardrail, to the far shoulder. He set her down on the embankment's grass and turned back to track the fire's progress. The engine compartment went fully alight approximately 25 seconds after he had cleared her from the vehicle. He had known it would. He could hear behind him the sound of the onlookers reacting to the burst of flame, and below that sound, the woman breathing. He crouched beside her and checked her pupils by the firelight, even, and her hands for injury. She was looking at him with an expression he had seen before on people who had been very close to something irreversible. Not gratitude yet. Just the specific, stunned focus of someone recalibrating what they understood to be possible. "What is your name?" she said. Her voice was precise, despite everything, as though she had decided that orienting herself factually was the most efficient way to manage what she was feeling. "Garrett," he said, "you're safe now." She held his gaze for a moment that stretched longer than the question warranted. In the distance, the first siren was audible. Garrett stood, called in the accident details to the dispatcher who answered, gave his name and the approximate location, and then watched the paramedics arrive with the attention of someone reviewing a process for quality. When they moved to take over, he handed off the information they needed. Her apparent consciousness level, the site of impact, the estimated duration of smoke exposure. In the organized sequence of someone who had given such reports before in contexts larger than this. He declined to be interviewed by the 2 deputies asking questions of the bystanders. He found his truck, still idling on the shoulder where he'd left it. Maddie was waiting for her medicine. By 7 the following morning, the story had already outrun the facts. A video clip posted by one of the bystanders showed a figure in a dark work jacket moving through smoke toward the burning car. But the angle was wrong for the rescue itself, and the caption that spread with it read, "Unknown bystander pulls woman from wreck. Identity unknown." By noon, 3 regional outlets had picked up the story, and by 3 in the afternoon it had reached the national feeds. None of them had a name. All of them had the image of Celeste Mercer being assisted by paramedics, her face composed, her left hand bandaged where broken glass had opened a thin cut across her palm. Vaughn Mercer appeared at a brief press availability outside Mercer Automotive's headquarters at 2 o'clock. He wore the expression of a man who had practiced it and spoke with the careful, measured sorrow of someone delivering bad news about another person's character. He said that Celeste had been under enormous pressure. He said that the company's safety protocols required a review whenever any company vehicle was involved in an incident. He said, twice, that the priority was her health and recovery, and that there were questions about the circumstances of the accident that needed to be understood before any conclusions were drawn. He did not say she had been driving recklessly. He did not need to. The garage on Aldrich Road was quiet through the morning. Garrett had opened at the usual time, taken on a transmission job from a regular client named Earl, and said nothing about the previous night to anyone. It was his regular customer, Doris, who brought in her Buick every 4 months and always arrived with news, who mentioned it first, setting her keys on the counter and saying she'd heard some mechanic from out of town claimed he'd pulled that poor CEO out of the fire. But the video didn't show any of it, and she personally thought the whole thing sounded exaggerated. Garrett handed her the work order to sign without comment. At midday, 2 men from the feed store down the block stopped in the bay doorway. One of them said he'd heard it was actually Garrett who pulled her out, and the other laughed and said if Garrett had really done it, he would have at least gotten a photo with her. And both of them seemed to find this reasonable. Garrett, beneath the Buick's rear axle, said nothing. Earl, who had been watching from the waiting chair with a cup of burned coffee, looked at Garrett's feet sticking out from under the car, and then looked at the 2 men, and quietly went back to his phone. Maddie heard it from the girl who sat next to her at school, who had heard it from her older brother, who had heard it as a joke. Your dad says he saved that lady's life, but nobody saw him do it. Maddie had not responded because Garrett had raised her with the knowledge that responding to certain statements only validates the frame the statement was built in. But she sat with it quietly through the afternoon, and when Garrett picked her up at 3:15 and she climbed into the passenger seat, she said her throat was still a little scratchy and nothing more. That evening, while he was making dinner, she looked up from her homework at the kitchen table and said, "Dad, did you do it because it was right, or because you wanted people to know?" Garrett stirred the pan for a moment. "Doing the right thing," he said, "isn't for the applause." Celeste Mercer was not the kind of person who rested in hospital beds. She was checked in for observation through the first night, released before noon the next day, and by 2 o'clock was in a private meeting room at a facility Mercer Automotive maintained for sensitive technical work, sitting across from the company's most trusted systems engineer, a quiet man named Dale, who had worked for her father before he worked for her. Dale had pulled the vehicle's event data recorder and the wireless gateway logs from the cloud backup the car had transmitted automatically in the 17 seconds before the accident. And what he showed her on the screen was not the story Vaughn had been telling. There was an 18-second window, beginning approximately 4 minutes before impact, during which a lateral channel in the vehicle's driver assist architecture had received a command string from an external source. The source was not the Mercer Automotive Operations Network. It was not a maintenance diagnostic system. It was a MAC address Dale could not yet trace, operating on a frequency the Phoenix series had been designed to use for its over-the-air update capability, the same capability that Vaughn had championed accelerating the timeline on during a board meeting 8 months prior. The command had not disabled the car's systems entirely. It had degraded them in a pattern calibrated to appear like cascading sensor failure under pressure, a driver who seemed tired, a vehicle that seemed to be approaching its maintenance cycle. It was, Dale said carefully, looking at her rather than the screen, as precise as anything he had ever seen. Celeste sat with this information for a long time before she spoke. Then she asked her assistant to find out everything available about a man named Garrett Holloway in Briar Glen. The assistant returned 20 minutes later with a sparse file, a mechanic's license, a property record, a brief obituary for his wife Eleanor from 4 years prior, a daughter enrolled at Briar Glen Elementary. There was no business registration beyond the garage, no notable affiliations. Nothing that explained the way he had moved through that accident site, or the way he had given the paramedic report, with the precise vocabulary of someone who had done it before in contexts that were not roadside emergencies. She sent a courier to the garage with an envelope containing a handwritten note and a check drawn on her personal account, not the company's, for a sum she considered appropriate to the reality of what had happened. The courier returned 3 hours later with the check and a note in response, written on the back of a parts order form in a plain, unembellished hand. "You being alive is enough." Celeste put the note in her desk drawer rather than the file. She was not certain why, but she did. Delaney Brooks arrived at the garage that same afternoon. Delaney was 31, a reporter for the Briar Glen Courier, and occasional contributor to a regional investigative outlet, and she had a particular talent for arriving in places slightly before other people decided those places were interesting. She introduced herself through the bay door, and Garrett walked out from under a car and said hello with the courtesy of someone who was not pleased but was not going to be impolite about it. She asked if she could ask him a few questions about the previous night. He said he appreciated her interest, but he didn't have anything useful to add to what was already in print. She thanked him and left. She sat in her car for 10 minutes before driving away, and in her notebook she had written one phrase: "Not afraid, not avoiding, something else." That evening, Celeste's personal phone received a message from a number that traced to a disposable device. The message contained 8 words: "The man who saved you knows more than you realize," and a second line added below the first that she read 3 times before she put the phone face down on the hotel desk. "If you pull him into this, you may not be able to protect either of you." The article appeared 2 days later in a local digital publication that most people in Briar Glen encountered as a link from a community board. The headline was enough: "Local mechanic claims credit for CEO rescue. Experts question timeline." The story quoted no experts by name. It said that eyewitness accounts were inconsistent. It suggested, in language careful enough to avoid legal liability but not careful enough to avoid damage, that someone had been circulating a version of events designed to generate attention for a small business struggling with declining revenue. 3 appointments canceled the following morning. A 4th called and left a voicemail that included the phrase, "Just waiting to see how this shakes out." Earl stopped by and said nothing directly, only sat in the waiting chair longer than his errand warranted, which was its own kind of solidarity. The bank called about the property note on the house. Not a threat, merely a courtesy reminder of the upcoming quarterly review, in a tone that managed to be both technically routine and specifically timed. Garrett took each of these things in order, without comment, the way he took everything that arrived in the category of things he had not asked for. Tessa Holloway drove 4 hours from her firm and arrived at the garage at 7 in the evening, which she knew was when Garrett would still be there and when Maddie would already be home with the neighbor. She was 34, 11 years younger than her brother, and she had the particular sharpness of someone who had watched a capable person choose smallness and had spent years deciding whether to say something about it. She said it now, from the doorway of the back office, with her arms crossed and her suit jacket still on. "You have 2 former federal investigators, a forensic data team, and 3 law firms that owe you favors you've never collected," she said. "1 phone call, Garrett. 1. Garrett wiped his hands on a shop towel. "And then what? I bring all of that down on Briar Glen, on Maddie." "You're already in it," Tessa said. "The difference is whether you're in it alone." He did not answer immediately. Tessa had his eyes, the same quality of stillness, and she knew when her brother was thinking rather than shutting down. She sat on the edge of the metal desk and waited. Celeste arrived the following afternoon without her assistant, without a company vehicle, in a rental car she had booked under a different name. She stood at the bay door until Garrett looked up, and then she walked in with the straight-backed manner of someone accustomed to rooms that require it, and she set a tablet on his workbench, showing the data Dale had pulled from the event recorder. She did not present it as a request. She presented it as information she thought he would understand. He looked at the data for 3 minutes. He asked 2 technical questions about the wireless channel frequency. He asked where the vehicle had last been serviced. Then, without looking up from the screen, he picked up one of the accident scene photographs that Delaney Brooks had sent him, unsolicited, without explanation, and studied the tire marks and the angle of impact for a long time. "The approach vector is wrong for driver error," he said. "Even at speed on a wet road, the right front initiated the deviation, not the steering. Something told the front wheel assist to correct left when the road curves right." He set the photograph down. "That's not a malfunction. That's an instruction." Celeste watched him. "You've seen this before." He looked at her directly for the first time since she had walked in. "I've seen what people do when they want something to look like an accident." He paused. "I didn't like it then either." He said nothing more that afternoon about helping her. He thanked her and showed her out. But when she was gone, he stood in the open bay door for a long time watching the road, until Maddie came home from the neighbors on her bicycle and stopped on the gravel and said, "Dad, you have the face." He asked her what face. She said, "The face where you're deciding something." He opened the safe at 11:45 that night after Maddie had been asleep for 2 hours and the neighbor's porch light had gone dark. He had sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold and thought about it, with the systematic patience he brought to everything that mattered. What was already in motion, what would follow if he remained still, what it would cost Maddie to be the daughter of a man who had watched something be done to an innocent person and chosen to stay quiet, because the cost of speaking was personal. He carried the satellite phone to the kitchen table and peeled back the static bag. The charge indicator showed 91%. He had maintained it the way he maintained everything he hadn't yet decided to abandon, quietly, consistently, without announcing to anyone that he was doing it. The number he dialed was not stored in the phone. He knew it the way he knew the sound of an engine with a failing bearing, through a kind of knowing that has moved past memory into reflex. It rang twice. Calloway. The voice was the same as it had always been. Rhett Calloway was 61, a former logistics commander who had spent 7 years working for Garrett before Garrett had dissolved the operational structure and gone to Briar Glen. In those 7 years, Rhett had moved people, vehicles, and information across 4 continents without leaving a trail that anyone had ever successfully followed. And he had done it not out of mercenary instinct, but because he had decided, early on, that Garrett Holloway was a man worth working for. The decision had not changed, merely because the work had stopped. "It's Garrett," he said, although he knew Rhett already knew. There was a silence on the line that was not uncomfortable. Then Rhett said, "It's been a while." "It has." Garrett looked at the dark window above the kitchen sink. "I need 30 vehicles, black, clean registration. No hardware. Drivers who know how to be present without being a problem." Another silence. Not hesitation, consideration. Timeline? 48 hours. Location? Garrett gave him the address of the house on the tree line in Briar Glen. Then he said, "I also need the Mercer Automotive historical ownership filings going back 12 years. Corporate layering, if there is any. Any name that connects to a shell registered in Delaware with automotive sector positioning. Financial structure to your sister by morning," Rhett said. "One more thing." Garrett paused. He had been thinking about this particular item for the past hour, and had not been certain until this moment that he would say it. When the vehicles arrive, I want the lead car to carry the HSG identifier. Visible. The silence this time was slightly longer. They'll know who they're dealing with. That's the point. There was a pause. Then Rhett said, "They'll ask what name you want to arrive under." Garrett set the phone flat on the table for a moment and looked at it. He thought about Maddie on the bicycle on the gravel, the face where you're deciding something. He thought about Eleanor, who had told him once that the hardest thing about being extraordinary was that ordinary people needed you to be ordinary so they could feel safe. He thought about the data on the event recorder that showed a 4-second window in which someone had decided that another person's life was an acceptable operational variable. He picked the phone back up. "My real one," he said. The fog off the lake was still heavy at 6:45 when Maddie padded to the window in her socks and pulled back the curtain. She stood there for a full minute without moving, which was unusual for a child who typically moved continuously from the moment she woke. Garrett was in the kitchen when she appeared in the doorway and said, in a voice that was careful and very quiet, "Dad, there are a lot of cars." He had known they would be there. He had not known, somehow, that seeing them through Maddie's eyes would affect him the way it did. He followed her to the window and looked out at the 30 black Rolls-Royces arranged in 2 parallel lines along the narrow road in front of the house, their surfaces dark and mirror-smooth in the early light, the fog sitting low around their wheels in a way that made the scene look like something assembled by a production with more resources than restraint. The drivers stood outside the vehicles, in dark suits, hands clasped, entirely still. Nobody was on a phone, nobody was talking, nobody was performing. Maddie turned and looked at him. "Whose are they?" "Some old colleagues," Garrett said. He put his hand on her shoulder. "They're here to help with something." The neighborhood woke in the way of small towns faced with the inexplicable. Slowly at first, then all at once. Dorothy, 3 doors down, came onto her porch and stood with her coffee mug suspended halfway to her mouth. The 2 men from the feed store drove past twice before they parked and got out. By 7:15, perhaps 40 people had gathered at the edges of the road in the particular posture of people who aren't sure whether what they're watching requires them to do something. Rhett Calloway stepped out of the lead vehicle and walked up the front path and up the 2 steps to the porch and stopped in front of Garrett. He inclined his head in a way that was not theatrical and was not subservient, but that occupied the specific register of one person's recognition of another person's actual standing. Not the standing that had been claimed or performed, but the standing that had been earned and then deliberately set aside. "Mr. Holloway," Rhett said. Garrett had spent 11 years ensuring this moment would never arrive. Now that it had, he found he did not feel what he had expected. He felt, mostly, tired in the way of someone who has been holding something at arm's length for a very long time. "Thank you for coming," Garrett said. Maddie was watching from just inside the doorway, her socks still on, her hair unbrushed, her face doing the particular math that 9-year-old faces do when they are recategorizing information faster than they have words for. Garrett turned to her and said, quietly, "I'll explain everything. But right now, we have a Saturday morning. Do you still want pancakes at Elwood's?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him at the 30 cars, and the 40 neighbors, and Rhett Calloway standing on the porch path. Then she looked back at her father. "Yes," she said. Across the city, Celeste received a message from Preston Tate, the company's senior outside counsel, who communicated by message only when something required a record. The message said, "Holloway Sentinel Group. Look at the original incorporation documents. Look at who signed as founding principal." She already knew, by the time she looked, what she was going to find. But seeing his name there, Garrett James Holloway, in the terse language of a Delaware incorporation filing dated 14 years prior, was different from knowing. She sat with the phone in her hands for a long time. Vaughn received the news about the vehicles from one of his aides and spent several minutes insisting it was unrelated to their situation before a second aide placed a photograph of the HSG identifier on the lead vehicle's windshield on the desk in front of him. Vaughn had built his entire strategy on the certainty that Garrett Holloway was a mechanic in a small town who would not want the attention. The photograph did not change what Vaughn had done. It changed with considerable finality what he could do next. Delaney Brooks arrived in Briar Glen just as Garrett and Maddie were returning from Elwood's, Maddie with syrup on her sleeve and Garrett carrying the small white bag of leftovers he always ordered for the neighbor. Delaney stood on the road looking at the remaining vehicles and then looked at Garrett and said, "Would you like to tell me what's actually happening?" he said. "Not yet. But soon." The Mercer Automotive International headquarters occupied the top 6 floors of a glass tower in the financial district, and the conference room on the 24th floor had been designed to communicate authority through the medium of material cost. The table was a single slab of pale stone, the chairs Italian leather, the view arranged so that all other buildings appeared shorter. Vaughn had spent 48 hours assembling his case. A communications consultant, 2 outside attorneys, and a report from a forensic accounting firm paid to find evidence of erratic decision-making in Celeste's leadership record, which found, because it was paid to find, something it was willing to call evidence. The narrative was complete, an executive under too much pressure, a board with fiduciary duties, a company that needed stability. None of it was false enough to be easily litigated. All of it was false enough to be devastating. The disruption began before the session opened. Vaughn's senior attorney was reviewing prepared remarks when his assistant came in and said, in a voice designed to conceal its alarm, that there were vehicles outside, many vehicles, and that Vaughn's outside counsel had just received word that the name Holloway Sentinel Group had appeared in a public records request, filed the previous evening, filed by a woman named Tessa Holloway, whose last known firm affiliation was as a partner in the legal division of Holloway Sentinel Group before it was restructured. Garrett walked into the conference room at 9:11, 4 minutes after the session was called to order, wearing a suit that Rhett had provided and that fit correctly without announcing itself. He was accompanied by Tessa, who carried a document case, and Rhett, who stood near the door and required no instruction about his function. Garrett acknowledged Celeste with a brief nod. He did not acknowledge Vaughn. Preston Tate had been seated on the board side of the table and had been visibly struggling for 2 days, with the growing realization that he was sitting on the wrong side. When Garrett opened the folder in front of him, Tate leaned forward and looked at the document on top. A 17-page analysis of the Phoenix Series event data cross-referenced with access logs from the vehicle connectivity portal, and he set down his pen. Garrett did not give a speech. He presented the data in the manner of someone who had spent a career presenting data to people who needed to understand it quickly, simply, sequentially, with each element establishing the foundation for the next. The command string, the external MAC address, the corporate registration of the company that owned the address, a Delaware shell formed 18 months prior with a single registered agent and no disclosed principals, capitalized through a financial institution that appeared in 2 other places in the documents Tessa was distributing. Once in Vaughn Mercer's personal investment disclosures, and once in the documentation for a derivative position that would pay out substantially if Mercer Automotive stock dropped by more than 20% over a 60-day period. Vaughn said that any of this could have multiple explanations. He said it in the voice he used when he was buying time. Garrett looked at him across the stone table. "I've repaired engines long enough," he said, "to know the difference between a car that broke down on its own and a car that was told to break down." He let that sit for a moment. This car was told. Celeste stood up. She spoke in the voice she used when she was not managing a room but commanding it, and the difference was apparent to everyone present. She said that all pending governance motions were suspended, that the company's forensic team and its outside regulatory counsel had already received copies of the materials now being distributed, and that any board member who wished to discuss next steps would be doing so, from this point forward, on the record. Tessa Holloway understood that the most important moment in any proceeding is not the dramatic revelation but the instant when the people who have been calculating their positions realize the calculation has changed. She watched that moment arrive in the faces of 3 board members within 60 seconds of Celeste's statement. A slight retraction of the shoulders, a careful neutrality replacing the performed confidence of the morning. These were not Vaughn's committed allies. They were the people who had been standing close to him, because standing close to the most forceful person in a room is, in the absence of better information, the safest available strategy. Now they had better information. The financial picture Tessa laid out was not complicated, which was part of its power. Vaughn had acquired, through a series of transactions conducted through the shell company, derivative instruments that would generate a substantial return precisely in the scenario he had been engineering. A public confidence crisis around the Phoenix series, followed by Celeste's departure, followed by a period of leadership instability during which the company's valuation would contract, before recovering under new management. The position had been established incrementally over 18 months, in amounts and through channels carefully sized to avoid triggering automated surveillance flags. It was, Tessa said, setting the last document in front of Preston Tate, a plan that had required both significant resources and a genuine belief that no one would look closely enough to find it. Preston Tate looked at the document for a long time. He had been retained by Mercer Automotive for 9 years, and in that time he had seen the company managed by Celeste Mercer with a fidelity to its original purpose that he had found, without ever saying so aloud, admirable. He had allowed himself to be present at today's session without examining whose interests the session was designed to serve. He did not make a speech about this. He simply said, clearly and for the record, that in his professional judgment the evidence before the board was sufficient to require an immediate suspension of Vaughn Mercer's board participation and a referral to the appropriate regulatory authorities, and that he was prepared to facilitate both. Vaughn did not rage. He gathered his papers in the way of people who have run out of angles, and he stood and he said to Garrett, with a remnant of the authority he had started the morning with, "You have no idea what you've just involved yourself in." Garrett said, "I pulled someone out of a car that someone else arranged to crash. My involvement started there." Vaughn left. The room was quiet in the way of rooms from which something toxic has recently been removed. Delaney Brooks was waiting in the lobby when the session concluded, because Delaney understood that the lobby is where the actual story comes out of the elevator. She did not ask Garrett for a statement. She asked Preston Tate, which was the correct instinct, and Preston Tate, now clearly on the side of the record he should have been on from the beginning, gave her a statement more complete than she had expected. Celeste found Garrett in the corridor outside the conference room, and they stood at the window looking at the harbor below, and she asked why he had come back into all of this when he had left it so deliberately. "Because a car doesn't malfunction the way that car malfunctioned," Garrett said, "and if Vaughn had succeeded, the investigation would have concluded it was a design fault. Everyone who bought a vehicle from this company believing it was safe would have been told their trust was misplaced." He paused. "That bothered me more than the rest of it." She looked at him. "You cared about people you don't know." "I've always cared about people I don't know," he said. "That's why I left." The story broke across every major outlet by 8 that evening, and by the following morning the name Garrett Holloway had been searched more times than any individual name in the region since the last election cycle. The details assembled quickly. The founder of Holloway Sentinel Group, the firm that had quietly provided security infrastructure for some of the largest private transactions and asset transfers of the past decade and a half, had been living in a small town under his own name, operating a single-bay garage, raising his daughter alone, and had pulled a CEO from a burning car before returning home to give her cold medicine. The garage on Aldrich Road was not a functional workspace for 3 days. A national network requested a primetime interview. Private equity firms sent letters of inquiry within 24 hours. A former colleague reached out through Tessa to say the original team was available if Garrett ever wanted to reconstitute anything. Garrett declined every offer. Celeste held a brief press statement 2 days after the board session. She did not use Garrett's name as a narrative device or deploy his story to rehabilitate the company's public position. She said that the investigation had revealed a deliberate effort to undermine the Phoenix series launch and the company's leadership, that the responsible parties had been referred to regulators, and that the company's commitment to its safety standards remained absolute. She said that she owed her life to a man who had asked for nothing in return, and that this fact had clarified for her several things about what kind of leader she intended to be. She called Garrett directly afterward and reached him at the garage, where he had retreated to continue Earl's transmission job. He listened to a summary of her press remarks through the phone, with one hand still holding a torque wrench. She asked if there was anything she could do for him. He said that was a harder question than it sounded. She told him she had been thinking about his wife, about what Tessa had shared, that Eleanor Holloway had died of an illness that better diagnostic infrastructure in rural areas might have caught earlier. She said she was not asking his permission to do something he hadn't requested. She was asking whether, if she established a medical safety initiative in rural communities and named it after Eleanor, he would find that appropriate or intrusive. He put the torque wrench down. She would have found it appropriate, he said. She always thought I worried too much about the wrong things. Maddie was sitting on the back steps when Garrett came out of the garage that evening, a book in her lap and the long amber light of late autumn on her hair. He sat down beside her and she leaned against his shoulder the way she had since she was very small. After a while she said, "Dad, are you going to go back to all of that?" He watched the tree line for a moment. "No," he said, "but I think I might do something with it." She considered this. "Okay," she said, and went back to her book. 6 weeks after the board session, Mercer Automotive released a full transparency report on the Phoenix series safety architecture, co-authored by Dale and an independent firm, and filed concurrent disclosures with the relevant federal regulators. The report was notable not for what it found. The systems had been sound. The attack had been entirely external, but for the comprehensiveness with which it was presented and the specificity of its recommended improvements. The Phoenix series launched on its original schedule. The reception was, by every relevant measure, what Celeste had spent 2 years building it to be. Von Mercer's board membership was formally terminated. The regulatory proceedings moved at the pace such proceedings move, which is not fast, but they moved, and the financial positions he had taken dissolved in the unfavorable environment that followed his public exposure. He did not disappear from the world entirely. He became the kind of person present in a room without being invited into a conversation, which was, for a man of his particular temperament, a worse outcome than absence. The garage on Aldrich Road returned to its usual pace within a month. Garrett fixed Earl's transmission, replaced the wheel bearings on Doris's Buick, took on a restoration job for a man 2 towns over, who had a 1967 pickup and a great deal of patience. On the door frame of the back office, Mounted on a small wooden plaque that Maddie had painted the weekend after everything were the words Holloway Safety Foundation, Community Office in careful letters. The foundation's first 3 grants had gone to rural emergency response programs in 3 counties. The second round was already in review. The Rolls-Royce with the old-style key, the one from the safe, sat in the far corner of the garage under a canvas cover. Garrett had not decided what to do with it. On certain mornings, when the light came through the high bay windows at the right angle, the cover's outline was unmistakable, and Maddie had taken to calling it the ghost with the affectionate irreverence of a child who understands that some things in her father's life are allowed to remain unresolved. Celeste came to Briar Glen on a Tuesday in late autumn, arriving in the same kind of rental car she had used before, with a rolled set of documents under her arm. She found Garrett beneath an old truck and waited, and he rolled out and stood up and looked at the papers she handed him. They were design specifications for an autonomous vehicle safety override architecture, the component the Phoenix series had been missing, and in the margin of page 4, in pencil, was a notation that appeared to be incorrect. He looked at it for a moment, picked up a shop pencil, corrected it, and handed the documents back. "You could come back to this world," Celeste said, "properly. You know that." Garrett looked toward the open bay door, where the gravel lot was turning gold in the late afternoon light, and where Maddie's bicycle was parked against the fence with a new scratch on the rear fender she hadn't mentioned yet. He looked back at Celeste. "I never left," he said. "I just decided what was worth staying for." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she nodded, in the way of someone who has been given an answer they intend to keep. She walked back to her car. Garrett watched it go, and then turned back to the truck and picked up his tools and went back to work.